It's my privilege today and humbling experience actually to sit at the table with such distinguished guests. One, of course, is joining us online. So we have three distinguished guests, and I think I will introduce them one by one shortly, if possible, so, because I want to hear, I'm eager to hear their statements. So I will start with Dr. Trachtenberg. Just go alphabetically. He is the president of the Global Commerce Institute of Lee and Co. Currently, but in this audience, I think he's also a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies in Seoul National. But to us, he's well known as a Minister of Trade a few years back. And also the representative of Korea who ran for the leadership of the World Trade Organization in 2013, I believe. So I don't, without further ado, I want to ask Professor Park to give us his opening remarks, if you have any.
Into the discussion.
All right, I am pretty happy about this. So let me then continue with Professor Michael Reiterer. Michael is our representative on this panel from Europe. He has had an amazing career as well, both in academia, but also in government. His native country is Austria. A very important European Union member. So he has had a political career in Austria, but also a political career in the EU. Reading through the short bio sketch that we have on this list, he is a distinguished professor at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, which is at the Brussels School of Governance, and he is the editor of the policy brief series of that school. So as I said, he has served in many positions in the EU and in Austria, and several of them have to do with East Asia. So he is very well qualified to talk about the topic of this first panel. And finally, let me close with our third panelist, who is online, who is joining us online. And I understand that the reason he's joining us online is because he is a very conscientious professor, like the rest of us, and he has to teach a class shortly in Harvard. So this is Robert Zelnick. Obviously, in the United States, there's hardly anyone in this town who has not heard his name and does not know who he is. He's currently a senior counselor at the Brunswick Group Geopolitical. He's also an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard. If you go through his bio sketch, you will understand my question is, how can one person do all these things in one lifetime? I don't know. But he was president of the organization next door here, the World Bank, for several years. He was a U.S. trade representative for a number of years. He has served in many different positions in the U.S. government, White House, and whatnot, and has received a number. Please read the second paragraph in his bio sketch. A number of medals and very important distinctions around the world, from various countries around the world. So he is certainly qualified to talk about the subject today. um, I don't know if before we go into the discussion, if Michael has an opening statement. Do you have, Michael?
At least if you ask the former ambassador to say something, he might say something, but we can go into the discussion, I think.
Okay, all right. Robert?
I'm sorry I can't be with you personally, but as you said, I'm teaching a class at Harvard and I've got both Korean and European students. So glad to be with you.
All right, very good. So I would let me sit then also next. I would go directly into Q&A then, because there is very little else to say. Everybody is waiting. So here is a question. The question is, as we heard before, that the world is being reorganized now. There is serious problems with fragility of global value chains. It's not a new issue. We all knew this. Actually, in this school, I teach classes. We have been talking about this since the Obama administration. That the global value chains are not exactly set up very appropriately. They are set up only on the basis of economic considerations and not necessarily other considerations that affect economics and geopolitical issues. Nevertheless, the COVID made this obvious, and thus currently we are in a major reorganization. The question is the following. We have global value chains. We have an organization of the international economic system. We are sort of in the process of reorganizing it extensively. Now, there will be costs to this. If you ask an economist like me, I will tell you there will be very serious economic costs to this. This is not going to be easy. Everybody, there will be costs for everybody. So the question is how actually to react to this as people who understand the international system. What's the correct way, the better way, not the optimum way. I'm not saying the optimum, but the better way to react to these changes internationally. Let's start from this. Yes.
Well, I didn't say any opening remarks, but I will say two sentences.
Great.
Thank you, Professor Vonortas. I will thank conference organizers for inviting me to this important gathering. I would also like to thank you for your serving the moderator in this session. I specifically more particularly thank Ambassador Catherine Stevens who organized, all kind of thing along with Mr. Kim and so. Well, let me directly answer your question. First question. My answer is based on my individual expertise, representing Korea, but it's my personal view. And there seem to be three main causes for the recent supply chain restructuring issues. First, as you mentioned, COVID-19 pandemic and the war between Russia and Ukraine. The second, the US measures based on the national security concerns. The third, politically motivated nationalism, which emphasizes domestic production more than trade, and they emphasize reshoring more than globalization. All of this may disrupt supply chain and distort trade and foreign direct investment. So Korean firms, I don't know exactly how they are reacting, but I heard many of them are diversifying their supply sources of core materials, parts, and components. Obviously, it will cost, increase the cost of doing business because of this kind of reaction. And also, some firms even consider a strategy of establishing vertical integration of the supply chain. At the same time, Korean government will evaluate unilateral measures based on the national security concerns to to see if they violate the rules of WTO. At the same time, Korean government will faithfully implement the RCEP agreement. We joined the RCEP a couple of years ago, and also try to accede to the CPTPP to secure more stable supply chain opportunities within the region. Regarding politically motivated protectionist measures, we should consider, I think this is a very important topic to discuss more, but I just simply say that, we should consider establishing inclusive trade policies to help workers, industries, and small and medium-sized enterprises that may have suffered from globalization and trade. I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Well, thank you. I think there is nothing to add to the analysis of some of the reasons, but I would just add that when we think back a little bit, that the idea of strategic autonomy, reshoring, friendshoring, and so on has already started before the pandemic, and it has, it's not as new as we sometimes are made to believe. Because we had seen, I would say, from 2016 onwards, a stronger intervention of governments into the economy, encouraging the domestic industries and impeding cross-border goods and capital flows. The definition of nationally sensitive industry and technologies, limits on foreign direct investment, these were all issues which we have seen in 2016. Then we had the add-on of the pandemic. The pandemic changed our perception fundamentally, because suddenly we made the experience that high-tech products like the mask you're wearing became a strategic good. And I think that added to the idea of reshoring. So I think that each and every government has an obligation to make sure that its population is prepared for pandemic, is prepared for economic shocks, and measures have to be taken. And I think there is now the crucial point. We have seen it also in the European Union when the pandemic started. We had the reflex in member states. We have to do it alone. And unfortunately, that took only about less than a month. And then there was cooperation, there was collective buying, purchasing, negotiation, also to make sure that there was a development of vaccines. Then there was the next tremendous step by the European Union in having Euro bonds in order to finance the costs of re-establishing the economy. Well, I think we were on a good path, and then we had the war in Ukraine. And that is enormous costs are coming on us. And because of the war, we have now the add-on of energy prices, and they have to be financed. And that comes also to your question. Governments can cushion the effects to a certain degree, but at one moment, companies and also private households will have to put a higher bill of energy. And we will see that very soon. And one has to prepare people for that. But on the other hand, and this is the international dimension, if I look now at the differential of energy prices between the European Union and the US and Asian countries, if there's a differential of 1 to 5 to 1 to 7, well, that has a very strong economic impact. That has an impact on competition. And I think there is now the element where the strategic cooperation with friends and allies has to come in. So shoring to make sure that there is an access to energy has become not only important strategically, but it has also a very strong economic competition element. And I think that's also necessary that we talk about these issues, because it will be very difficult to explain to the electorate in Europe, wherever they are. We have to shoulder basically alone the higher costs of energy. I think this is an important issue, and this is where geopolitics meets geoeconomics in a very strong manner. So I think that's something I would like to put a flag. The second issue I would like to flag is, of course, and when you take measure to restart or to support an economy, one should be as conscious as possible, and I'm very carefully formulating that, not to discriminate. And discrimination in favor of national champions, I have mentioned that at the beginning, is of course a danger. And if you choose national champions, which are important perhaps for the transition to a green economy, then I think we have a problem. And we also have a problem amongst allies and friends if there is not enough consultation. I think that's the second issue to flag. And perhaps the third issue, and that links us a little bit. I was negotiating in the World Trade Organization. I spent 5 years of my public life in trying to set up the World Trade Organization. And therefore, I'm a little bit personally biased, but I think we need a functioning international trading system. And I think there we have now talking between the EU and Korea. In Korea, a strong partner. There is an interest, and you were a living interest in that. But we have a World Trade Organization which is dysfunctional. And there is the appellate body, which was brought to death, as there is no nomination of judges, basically. And we have seen a change of administration, but we have not really seen a strong change of attitude when it comes to the WTO. And I think this is something which we should take up, because working on this framework of international trade rules, this is certainly something Korea, US, and EU can do together, because we have an interest in a stable environment, trade environment, even if we are economic competitors. And I think this is something which unites us, and where all the talk about common interests, common values should be translated as quickly as possible into concrete actions to get the WTO back on track, because otherwise we will have minilateral, plurilateral, bilateral arrangements, which at the end of the day are to the detriment of the multilateral trading system. And one of the key functions of the WTO is also to protect the weaker ones. So I'm not in favor, to say it also clearly, in concluding all kinds of framework agreements. The framework agreement avoids an FTA, and if you have an FTA, you have Article 24 of GATT, and then you can control it. And if you have framework agreements below that level, maybe there are good domestic reasons for that, but talking internationally, it is not good. And they also lack normally one strong element, which is market access. So if we want to get the ball rolling again, I think this is what we have to do as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Michael. I understand that global governance is a key issue here, and I could not agree more, because as an economist, every economist actually from day one understands that the basic, the underlying situation for every market to function well is good property rights. If we know, if it is very well known by all the players what the rules are, then things work well. Otherwise, not. Okay, let's turn to Robert. Robert, please.
So, just to complement the two good opening remarks, when asked to participate in this, I wanted to agree, because I think the trilateral relationship with Korea and the European Union is very important. Having said that, in some ways, you couldn't have asked for better timing of this conference, given some of the recent announcements of U.S. policy. And so, to start, Nicholas, with one of your observations, I'm often asked whether globalization is in retreat. And I draw a distinction between the phenomenon of globalization and the governance of globalization. On the phenomenon, if you look around and you think about climate or pandemics or energy and food prices or interest rates and monetary policies and debt, it's a little hard to come to the conclusion that globalization doesn't remain quite vibrant and active. However, the governance is fraying and fragmenting, and particularly as Michael's sort of last remarks of that nature. I think it's of course understandable, and Minister Vark mentioned this, in the aftermath of lessons of COVID and some of the Chinese controls of exports, that businesses would want to try to build resilience, have alternative sources, flexible means to cushion disruption, and that this is a combination of both business and government policy. But I think in recent year, actually, you've seen a major development on the US front. And it gives me no comfort to say this. I don't actually agree with a lot of these policies, but they're a reality, which is, I think, that while Korea in its development history has had an industrial policy, the US industrial policy was perhaps a more fluid process. But if you look in the recent legislation dealing with electronic vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, the United States has really now moved quite actively to the nature of a much more directed industrial policy. This has huge implications for Korea, given the nature of the Korean economy. Korea is actually in the forefront of a number of these technologies. And so it will be affected, as we can talk about during the day, with the particular rules on electronic vehicles or the announcements yesterday about semiconductors. And I think one has to recognize that this comes back significantly to the US policy on China. And one saw the reports yesterday of the US national security strategy, but the United States is headed for an economic confrontation with China. And that will involve both Korea and the European Union. So by way of opening comments, I will just say that I think it is critically important for both partners, both of whom are strong allies, have long-standing relations with the United States, to try to shape the nature of these policies. As you could see we could talk about this more in the case of electronic vehicles, the policy even changed in the United States from the initial proposals that the Biden administration had in the Build Back Better Act to the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, in some ways, they didn't alleviate some of the concerns of South Korean auto companies. They're probably okay for South Korean battery companies. But I simply use this as an example of the fact that that's a different dynamic than US policy had even 5 or 10 years ago. President Trump introduced a much more transactional nature to trade. I wasn't sympathetic with that approach either. But what you're now seeing the United States moving towards in the technology area is a much more directed policy. And frankly, like others on the panel, I'm concerned about the international effects of this. But as a reality, it will proceed. And it's all the more important then to have the type of engagement in some detail with our close allies and partners, certainly including the European Union and South Korea, so people understand the full implications of this. The last observation I'll make on this is that this, of course, will bear costs. Interdependence hasn't gone away. We're just adding frictions to the system. But as a policy matter, I think this will be the new reality.
Very good. Thank you, Robert. In fact, we have one question that is directly linked to this, and it's from Dr. Kim here. Let me read it. There have been many opinions about the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, from opinion leaders and the public in Korea. I would like to hear evaluations on IRA from the American side and the European side. That's what's on my side. Who wants to start? We can go, Michael. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not talking on the US behalf.
No.
No, I think the position and the feeling in Europe is quite clear and straightforward. That these measures discriminate against EU producers in favor of US-based producers. It is clear that this is not a measure which contributes to the reduction of greenhouse gases. It is not a measure which is in line with the necessary transition we are working on. I'm sure my colleagues would have been more happy if there had been, first of all, no discriminatory element. Secondly, if there had been consultation about that issue. And fundamentally, also from the economic point of view, I think there is the prevailing view that these are measures which are not cost effective. They are not to increase the efficiency of production methods at all, because it is actually protectionist measures. And one of the convictions is that there is actually no protection in protectionism. And I think this is something which one should learn. Yeah, I remember when I was still ambassador in Korea and there was the renegotiation of the chorus, there was attached a protocol which allowed the import of US cars which did not fulfill the environmental standards of Korea. So I think if we have an all-in government approach, then also those who are in charge of environmental protection or are in charge of fighting climate change should also be part of that decision-making process. It should not be that one side of the government is saying A and the other side of the government is saying B. I think this is also a very big political challenge because we tend now to downplay the importance of all the measures which should be taken for climate change. We had the first layer was COVID. But okay, now we have to take care of COVID. Now we have the war in the Ukraine. Now we have to take care of the war. And who is taking care of climate change? So at least the measures which are taken and the money which is spent should be spent in a manner which is trying to catch two birds at the same, or even three birds at the same time. And unfortunately, this is not the case with the Inflation Reduction Act. And the best solution, if I may make a recommendation, change it.
Well, even though Dr. Kim asked the opinions from European side and US side, but I have to say Korean side. Well, when you mention about Korean porous FTA, we emphasize the requirement of the environmental standard of Korean government regulations, but we gave enough exceptions for each company, maybe 50,000 cars. You don't have to worry about this. So when we introduce this regulation, we give some exceptions. So based on that kind of argument, I think we want to see U.S. government to give some exceptions for electric vehicles manufactured in Korea until the Korea car makers start producing electric vehicles in the United States. There are two aspects. I mean, even this kind of proposal was made by Senator Ralph Warnock of Georgia State last month. I don't know whether this idea will be moving forward or not, but in any case, there are two aspects to support this kind of proposition, because Korea has an FTA with the United States. You cannot be discriminated even though you are FTA member. And also, more importantly, Hyundai Motor Group has committed to invest more than $10 billion to produce electric vehicles in the United States. Now you are penalizing this kind of Korean car makers. So hopefully, this is a little bit out of blue, but we hope the IRA get amended, that the tax credit rules maybe apply if they want to do something only to EV batteries, not the EV vehicles. In any case, if these suggestions are not accepted, maybe Korean government is considering bringing the case to WTO, or as well as Chorus FTA dispute settlement procedures. Before I let Seoul to come here, some people are suggesting, in this situation, everything is not correct, not amended, then Korean car makers may have to provide some kind of price discount to the American consumers who didn't get the subsidies. So they want to compensate the subsidies they didn't get. So it makes a huge complication to Korean car makers who made a strong commitment to invest $10 billion in the United States. So something must be reconsidered. I don't know about that because we have an election coming up in November, all kind of political situation in the United States. We don't have a huge amount of hope, but something must be considered.
Thank you. Indeed, this was the climate of the discussion in Seoul last week. Robert, do you have
Yes.
comments?
So let me set the context for this because I think it helps explain the new era that we will be in. All of us know the sensitivity of some traditional industries with protectionism and politics. The steel industry being the most prominent. But autos is probably a close second. And as Minister Vark will know, in Korea, there was often a frustration in the United States that some of the supposed safety rules about lights and other aspects always seem to be designed to keep out US cars. Michael will recall, I think the US tariff on autos is about 2.5%, European is about 10%. This is a sector that is very vulnerable to politics because it's an important industrial sector in all of the economies. Going back to a point that Michael made, that sector is going to be in the midst of a huge change because moving to electronic vehicles is going to change the whole nature of the manufacturing process that used to be for the engines in particular. Much of the rest of the cars may be similar. And so this is going to have a huge effects on jobs wherever cars are produced. I would add to this sort of to Michael's point, I think one has to recognize that the energy transition that we're now in the midst of could have the potential to be as significant to all our economies as the Industrial Revolution. These are huge transformations in the nature of our economies. And if those occur at a time like the present, where you're having more ideas about economic autonomy and protectionism, one has to be watchful of what will be the effects. So let's dig more particularly into the question of the electric vehicles, which are the cause of concern, particularly for Korea. In 2009, the United States passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And the idea was to give tax credits up to $7,500 for any producer of EVs up to a cap of 200,000. So that was an open system. It was a subsidy to encourage consumers to move to EVs. In the area of energy policy, one might have preferred, as opposed to having a subsidy, to actually have some form of carbon taxes, but that was politically unacceptable. Now, the main challenge for Korea was that Kia and Hyundai didn't export until 2021. So they're below, well below that 200,000 cap. Other companies in the United States, some of the European exporters are actually near the 200,000 cap. Then we go to the Build Back Better proposal that the administration had. And what I want to draw attention is the changes between that proposal and the Inflation Reduction Act. One change was in the Build Back Better, the batteries had to be just from the United States. In the final legislation, it included North America, which recognized the integration of the auto industries with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Another change was it allowed critical minerals to come from FTA partners. So there, Korea would be included, Japan would not, the EU would not. It removed a union requirement. And that was important because many of the foreign investors in the United States were in states that didn't have the union, didn't have auto unions, and so they would have been excluded. But it also removed the unit cap, and that was good for some companies that were nearing it, but it wasn't good for Hyundai and Kia. It also added a price cap for cars, which was probably a wise policy in my view, so as to limit the benefit for higher income people, and an income cap for buyers. Without debating the particular elements, what I want to draw to your attention is notice how the policy evolves over time. Now, Hyundai was caught because it's building an EV plant in Georgia, but that isn't expected to produce until 2025. Now, on the positive side, from Korea's point of view, at least my understanding, there are significant tax breaks given in Georgia. So it's not surprising you've got a Georgia senator who's sort of willing to make the case for Hyundai's set of plants. And as I alluded to in my opening comments, the Korean battery companies, LG and SK, will probably do quite well in this system. Ford is developing a relationship with SK. GM is doing one with LG. And we had the ironic situation where those two Korean companies were actually in the midst of litigation, stopping one another until the United States sort of mediated some dispute. Now, the other thing to watch in this area, and frankly, it's unclear from the initial legislation how far this will extend. There is an application of no content from foreign entities of concern. Well, that's clearly signaling China. And at least my understanding is in a lot of the production processes, the raw materials may not come from China, but China has been the assembly and the refiner of these materials. So one issue will be how will this affect the supply chains in the production process. So coming back to at least the Korean situation, the first important message is this is the dawn of a new era of industrial policies in the US, particularly for these sectors. And it'll be important for Korea to engage in the process and try to draw the distinctions that some of you have been drawing. Korea is an FTA partner. Korea is an ally. Now, the law will have to be implemented through regulations by the Treasury Department. I have no idea of the nature of how the Treasury will approach this, but one possibility would be to point to the fact that the Georgia plant is being developed by Hyundai and whether there's some transition rules until it sort of comes up to its level. I'm not suggesting that will happen, but I'm explaining this is the new trade policy world that we're moving into in the United States. The minister also mentioned another possibility. There's no prohibition for Korea selling its EVs in the United States. You're just not getting the benefit of the tax credit. So, of course, one other possibility is you lower the price until you can expand your production in the United States. And frankly, what I just went through with EVs, you're now going to see with semiconductors as well. So I just, in reading the news this morning, I saw that for some of the restrictions on semiconductor production with tools, that I think there's been a year extension for the South Korean production in China. But the question is how long that will last. And that's the big 500-pound gorilla in the room here. In addition to the normal politics of protectionism and the idea that if a country is going to use tax credits, it should go to sort of its companies and its workers. The real bigger challenge, I think, for Korea and to a degree the European Union is going to be as the US puts more technology restrictions, particularly in the semiconductors, in dealing with China, how will this limit the set of activities? Now, I'll just close by saying that there are counter arguments to these types of restrictions. By not being able to sell some semiconductors into China, it's probably going to hurt the profitability and the investment potential of these companies. But I'm trying to point out as an analyst, the Biden administration has taken a very strong and harsh position about China as a technology competitor. And I'm afraid that Korea in particular is going to get squeezed in this. Now, as the minister mentioned, it would certainly make sense for Korea to do the best that it can in terms of multiplying and diversifying its relationships. Both he and I would probably agree that it would be wise for Korea to join the CPTPP, which I think it's a mistake the United States pulled out of. It should try to use every opportunity it can, whether with relations to Southeast Asia, Japan, India, and others, to diversify. So the description that I'm giving you does not make me happy. This is not the direction of economic policy I would have pursued. But for the purposes of a practical discussion, I'm using this as an example to point out the fact that Korean and European partners who should have equities in the United States, not only as investors, but as allies, will have to engage the administration and the Congress on these type of industrial policy details.
Very good, thank you. And actually, I'd like to continue a little bit on this theme. So let's put a little positive on this. What do you see as the major issues underpinning the potential for cooperation? What's the potential for cooperation now between the US, Korea, and the EU? Is there the current situation with the Ukraine? Is it affecting this or not? Please.
Briefly.
Absolutely.
Well, three parties, in other words, EU, US, Korea, in this kind of particular situation, we can monitor and share information on the supply situation of key products and materials, such as energy, food, semiconductor, EV batteries, and critical minerals. They can also address joint countermeasures to deal with supply chain disruptions and secure stable supplies of key strategic products and materials. In these regards, the current Trade and Technology Council, we call TTC, between the United States and EU could be expanded to include Korea and maybe possibly Japan too, for example. Of course, as mentioned, Russia-Ukraine war enhanced the need for this type of cooperation among advanced, like-minded economies. Michael already pointed out, I want to emphasize one more time, I would like to note that the three parties should make joint efforts to revitalize the multilateral trading system of the WTO. I don't know whether US is committed or not, but this is a very important topic to discuss. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Mike?
Well, just a footnote to the discussion we had before. I mean, if I look at my country in Austria, we have a regulation which is in conformity with the European Union. When you buy an electric car, irrespective who is the maker, where is the producing country, what is the battery, you get a discount of about 2,500 euros because it should serve the environment. So if you want to copycat, I probably can provide you with the regulation, and I think that solves the problem. It is an incentive for the buyer, and it takes away all the discrimination which we have. And as we know, gratefulness is not a criteria in politics. So turning to something positive, I think that would be positive, by the way. let me flag one issue which is on my mind, and the minister referred to it briefly. I think we are risking to move from one dependency to the next dependency. We have experienced a dependency with oil, we have experienced a dependency with gas. Now we are looking into the emerging technologies, and now the name tells everything. We need rare earths and rare metals. And we will need more of them in the fourth industrial revolution, in the new technologies. So what are we doing? Are we preparing for that situation, or are we waiting for the next cartel to tell us what to do and what the price will be? At the same time, one situation is rather similar, with few exceptions like Australia. Most of the countries which are rich in rare metals and earths are not the democratic countries we would wish for. So if we are talking about cooperation among democracies, I think there's a problem. So what would be useful? I think the US, EU, Korea could think about that, because these are highly industrialized countries engaged in the emerging technologies, and we will need that raw material. So we should not wait until we have a problem. We should make contingency planning. I think that is something which I would put actually on the top of the agenda. Another issue which has to go on top of the agenda is all linked to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity needs by definition cooperation. There again, Korea is a very interesting case study, because it is one of the highest, best connected countries in the world, which creates the paradox that you are the most vulnerable to attacks. And what we do see that every moment, basically, the strategic infrastructure is increasing. And I think this is also an issue which we should address rather quickly. I mean, there are two cases of cybersecurity issues. One is more related to geopolitics, using it as a weapon, and then we have a part which is criminal activity. And I think concerning the latter, I would invite Korea to speed up the joining the Budapest Convention, because this is also a role model for cooperation to fight cyber crime. That's not the solution for the geopolitical part, but for the other crime. And I mean, this is close to my heart also, because we are just about to publish a book on cybersecurity policy in the EU and South Korea, from consultation to action. I plead guilty for that title, because I would like to see this transition from consultation to action. So, by the way, if you want to book, take note of it. I think there we already have a sort of good track record with Korea. The General Data Protection Regulation was accepted by Korea. Korea made some adaptations. By the way, this is also a role model, I think, for governance building. When you want to become partner of the General Data Protection Regulation, you don't have to adopt the European model, but you have just to make the necessary changes that the effectiveness of the protection is the same as in Europe. So you don't have to change the Korean system, you just have to adapt. And that was done. And I think creating there as much momentum as possible to have the general data protection is important for the exchange of data. And I think there we always have an issue with the United States, and I think Korea and the European Union could give a little bit help to our American friends to China's here. Another issue that I stop, but it comes to my mind because when I was in Seoul, I gave a speech, one of the first speeches on green financing at KEI. And I think that has taken up now a little bit of speed. The European Union has developed something which is called taxonomy. And this is necessary because everybody is in favor of green financing and green. Okay, but if my green is different from your green, which green is the right green? So we have to agree on that. And taxonomy is an issue, and we need that worldwide. And it is a market-conform mechanism because if you get, for example, all the big pension funds in the world and to invest only in certified green bonds, I mean, then you change very quickly the behavior in a market-conform manner. So these are just a few examples. If you want me to continue, just let me know. But back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Robert, on cooperation. You're muted.
Sorry. Let me just add 5 points to the good points that my colleagues have made. I think in President Kim's opening remarks, he mentioned the digital sector, and Michael's come back to that. If I were U.S. trade representative today, I would probably be focusing my efforts most on the digital trade. Even before the pandemic, you could see the change in its effect on supply chains and business relationships globally, but the pandemic supercharged and accelerated it. Sometimes people think that this issue is just for the technology industry, but it runs the gamut from industrial processes to airplane engines to agriculture. Anybody who's involved with business these days understands the importance of the data and digital sectors. And frankly, the standards and rules about when transfers are permitted, whether you have to have data localization, software requirements are still very, very fluid. And I think the challenge here is to find some common rules that allow countries to set their own standards for privacy, as the European Union has done, but also to encourage the exchange of the data because it's critical to future productivity and economies. And so I think for Korea as well, the EU already has this discussion with the United States, but I think it'll be very important for Korea to emphasize this as well. The second point goes back to the topic we discussed with EVs, which is the larger clean energy agenda. I think it would be useful, as Michael and others sort of brought out, to say, if you really want to move towards a clean energy policy or an EV policy, you're mixing your purposes if at the same time you're trying to just promote domestic production. So I think it would be probably useful to look at the full range of clean energy development, whether it's solar panels or whether it's transmission lines or whether it's different types of vehicles, and have a better understanding of how an integrated marketplace, at least among trusted partners, is important to be able to have this transition as efficiently and effectively as possible. Because otherwise, you're going to see the types of actions we saw through this recent US legislation, where particularly the bigger economies, it's the US, you'll see this in China, and frankly, as Michael knows, there's movements towards strategic autonomy in Europe as well. They'll think they can do it on their own, but they won't be able to do it on their own. But the politics will push them in that direction. The third point is one that I alluded to with semiconductors. We're going to face export controls with China. The question is, how far do we have to choke off all trade with China? Frankly, there are semiconductors and there are semiconductors. There's semiconductors at the high end that have sensitive security uses. There's a lot of other semiconductors that are not at the high end. And I think this is, again, where an important dialogue for the US with its closest allies needs to try to draw lines here and not necessarily reach too far in terms of trying to cut off the economic relations, which from my point of view will also add to acrimony with China. And then at times when you're going to want to have China on your side, whether it's dealing with climate or whether it's pushing Putin on reaching some resolution in Ukraine, you're not going to find China on your side. So that's I think another area. The fourth one also grows out of the Russia attack on Ukraine, and that I think some in the United States and Europe were surprised by the number of abstaining UN votes. Now, they had another vote yesterday. You had a smaller number of abstainers, but one could see that, frankly, many countries in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, Latin America had other priorities. Their priorities were dealing with the pandemic or debt and interest rates or food and energy prices. And so I think this, I hope, will make both the United States and Europe more attentive to the fact that if you want to bring these countries to your side, you're going to have to deal with some of their concerns. That's this topic, I'm sure, going on as we speak with the World Bank IMF set of meetings. And this brings us back to the WTO, which some of you have mentioned. And I think one of the point, again, for close partners and friends of the United States, particularly Korea and the EU, it would be useful to bring to the attention of the administration that if the administration is basically protectionist on trade, unwilling to have market access, you're going to lose friends that you will want to have in other contexts. And then that leads to the fifth point, the Trade and Technology Council. Michael might have a better sense of this, but when I was in Brussels, maybe now a couple months ago, I got a sense that the US use of that council is primarily focused on export controls with China, as opposed to some other broader industry development issues. I think it would be an excellent idea to draw our Asian partners into it. But again, this is where, as good friends, Europe and Korea, I think, need to press the administration that to, on the one hand, recognize the sensitivities about China, which are very sharp in Washington. The people at GW will be able to explain all this to people if they have any uncertainty. But at the same time, if you push these issues too far and you lose your partners and allies, you're not going to be effective. And you might also raise the larger strategic question, which is at the time that we're in the midst of a strong conflict with Russia, do you really want to also have a confrontation with China, which obviously turns on its head the Kissinger differentiation going back to the 70s. So I know I'm putting a burden on our friends and allies here, and I'm not saying it would be an easy one, because the attitude towards China is very, very strong in Washington. But on the other hand, I think there is a feeling in the administration that to be successful on these topics, one has to do it with allies and partners. And so the voices of allies and partners need to be heard on these topics.
Thank you, Robert. In fact, this is excellent, because the question I wanted to close with is the reaction of smaller countries similar to the reaction of bigger countries. There is this fallacy. I totally agree with Robert. There is this fallacy that the big countries, the United States, can do it on its own, can actually move forward without consultation and create the rules. And these times, I think, are over. Maybe there was a time like this, but it's coming to an end. We are only very few minutes away from finishing this panel. I would like to ask you three for closing statements.
I have a little bit long closing statement, but I want to shorten this. This is my the key issue of my closing remark is this. Considering all the policy measures happening in the United States, some trade experts, not only in Korea but also in the United States, are questioning whether U.S. is committed to defend or reform the rules-based multilateral trading system, or simply pursuing for anti-China or America policy. And as of now, it seems that the latter prevails. Many people agree with that. So naturally, in this case, there are some concerns in Korea that we may lose the justification for supporting the U.S. Recent trade policies. I mean, I have to say something else, but this is exactly the key message I want to raise. Conclude.
Very, very worrisome message.
Marco? I would also like to get the answer to your question. I think it's a good question, but if I talk now more as a political scientist professor, then I would say there is a tendency of large countries to be suspicious of international institutions because they think if they can do it bilaterally, they are stronger. And I think this is a fallacy, especially in today's economy. Even if the heydays of globalization may be over for some time, but we have already reached a degree of globalization that we cannot go back overnight, and it would not be in our interest. So the concern which I have is now that with all that reorganization, more resilience, and so on, one has there are legitimate security concerns which I would recognize any time, but it needs very fine-tuned measures in order to make sure to achieve the security goal and avoid that we destroy the international trading system or that we go into blocks. And I think this is one of the dangers that we end up with Western bloc, Chinese bloc, I don't know, and somewhere the Russians behind the Chinese. And that would be the end of a rule-based order, because whether we are in competition, whether we have security concerns, and in order to have economic exchanges, we need the rules of the road. And without it, we open the door and we go back to our good old friend Leviathan, and that's not in the interest because we have worked the last 70 years to overcome that. So the unraveling of what is called the liberal international order, I think that's the real danger. But what is also a danger is that people don't understand that we cannot continue as we have. We have to reform. We have to adapt and to develop a concept for that. I think that would also be a task which we could do together with the United States. But the United States has never shown a big interest in trade rules. Why did we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade as a provisional measure for 50 years? Because the US Congress did not like the International Trade Organization as in addition to World Bank and the IMF. So with the Clinton administration at the time, it was possible to come up with the WTO, but the love affair was over very quickly. So we have to rekindle love for the WTO. Not an easy task, but let's do it together because we have to manage the system. We have to adapt the system. We cannot stand still. Otherwise, we all lose.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Robert.
So I'll just make three brief points. One, to thank the conveners of this conference, because I think as our discussion has suggested, even in a brief time, you couldn't come across more timely issues. And I think there's a lot of follow-up to be done on each of the categories we mentioned. Second point, part of the follow-up, it will be the devil in the details. And this is where we've introduced this with EVs and batteries and semiconductors. And I think the critical necessity for close partners such as the European Union and Korea to engage the US government on the effects of this in terms of their common interests. But third, I don't want to totally give up on the macro issue. I mean, for example, today, inflation is obviously a pretty topical issue for all our countries. And one of the reasons that people may care about trade policy is that it raises costs and prices. So in some ways, people took this for granted. We've been in a decades-long period where you frankly had a huge expansion of the labor force in the global market economy. You had lower costs. You had highly unusual monetary policies. That is also in a huge period of transition. So I find, for example, when I talk to some US audiences, that the idea that, well, maybe trade protectionism raises costs and hurts your competitiveness and raises prices for consuming families starts to have more resonance along the way. So I do think that there's lots of moving parts. We've got polycrises going on here, from inflation to Russian invasion to the China-US tension to the energy transition. And I think one of the skills for a combination of policymakers and scholars together is how do you integrate those so as not to lose the benefits of the international system that we created over the course of 70 years?
Thank you. So I think the closing statement here is we need more cooperation. We need to keep talking, to keep listening to each other. That's what
We should bring Bright Robert into government. What do you think about that?
I want to thank our panelists. They did a great job. Let's give them a